In 2014, I wrote a book, Dark Emu, which exploded the myth that Aboriginal people were mere hunters and gatherers and did nothing with the land. I wrote the book because I found it hard to convince Australians that Aboriginal people were farming. Using colonial journals, the sources Australians hold to be true, I was able to form a radically different view of Australian history. Aboriginal people were farming. There's no other conclusion to draw. Colonial explorer Sir Thomas Mitchell rode through 9 miles of stooped grain. He wrote about seeing massive fields of Murnong tubers in Western Victoria. Lieutenant Grey, the first European explorer into many parts of Western Australia, was halted by yam fields that stretched to the horizon. Many explorers saw great harvests of grain in the very dead heart of Australia. Did you know that the hillsides of Melbourne were terraced for yam production by local Aboriginal people? In fact, there was such abundance of staple foods that Aboriginal people were able to preserve, store and trade vast quantities. But none of this information appears in any Australian book of history. Is this absence deliberate? I believe Australia is ready to discuss the ancient agricultural economy. Let's look at what the explorers reported of the Aboriginal agricultural landscape and see if you can remember any priest, parent or professor mentioning it. Were we the world's first agriculturalists? I was having trouble convincing academics at some of Australia's best universities of this farming tradition. After a meeting where I was chastised for misrepresenting Australian history, I realised I would have to use sources which all Australians respected. So on the way home, I went to the first second-hand bookshop I could find, and in the back room, I found a copy of Mitchell's Journeys into Tropical Australia. As soon as I read that he had ridden through 9 miles of stooped grain, I knew I would never have to apologise for this argument again. Mitchell's fellow explorers describe it as looking exactly like an English field of harvest, grain stooped for ripening. Stook. It's an interesting word, never to appear in the Aboriginal history Australians are taught. Mitchell also saw yam fields stretching as far as he could see at Garryword in Western Victoria. In his journey, he'd extolled the beauty of these plains, but assumed that God had made them just so that he could discover them, not once thinking how peculiar it was for the best soil in the country to have almost no trees. This was not God's work, but the intensive management of Aboriginal people, a managed field of harvest. In his journal, the missionary George Augustus Robinson reported seeing women stretched across these same fields of horticulture in the process of harvesting tubers. Lieutenant Grey was blocked in his explorations of Western Australia by yam fields stretching to the horizon, which were so deeply tilled he couldn't walk across them. Tilled. There's another word you've never heard in any Australian classroom. Isaac Beatty, one of Melbourne's first European farmers, wrote that the hillsides of Melbourne had been terraced to increase the production of yams and that the tilth of the soil was so light you could run your fingers through them. E.M. Kerr noticed that as he brought the first vehicle into the plains south of Echuca, that his cart wheels turned up bushels of tubers. Once again, some of Australia's best soils were almost bereft of trees, the plains having been horticulturally altered to provide permanent harvests of tubers to feed the population. But unlike Mitchell's self-indulgent congratulations, Kerr was aware of who had produced this productivity and later recognised that it was his sheep that destroyed it. Tilled, stooped, terraced, bushels, agricultural words, deliberately left out of our history that we teach our children. James Kirby is one of the first 2 Europeans in the country of the Wadi Wadi near Swan Hill. They passed gigantic mounds of bulrushes stacked up and steaming, and they wondered about the vast enterprise, but never thought about the productivity of that plant. Aboriginal people were harvesting the base of the stem as a delicious salad vegetable and making mounds of the leaves to process starch, just one more source of baking flour. Kirby notices a man fishing on a weir his fellows have built across the river. Well, Kirby assumes with great reluctance that blacks had built it, but only because he knows he is the first white man to see it. The construction of the dam included small apertures at the bottom so that water and fish movements could be controlled. Kirby describes the operation like this. A black would sit near the opening, and just behind him a tough stick about 10 feet long was stuck in the ground with the thick end down. To the thin end of this rod was attached a line with a noose at the other end. A wooden peg was fixed under the water at the opening in the fence to which the noose was caught. And when the fish made a dart to go through the opening, he was caught by the gills. His force undid the loop from the peg, and the spring of the stick threw the fish over the head of the black, who would then, in a most lazy manner, reach back his hand, undo the fish, and set the loop again around the peg. But how does Kirby explain the operation? He writes, I have often heard of the indolence of the blacks, and soon came to the conclusion, after watching a blackfellow fish in such a lazy way, that what I heard was perfectly true. So, weirs and constructions, machinery and productivity, all rendered by Kirby as laziness. Wasn't he describing an operation which would fit neatly into any description of European inventiveness and industry? There has been too little investigation into Aboriginal domesticates and the vast fields of agriculture witnessed by the explorers, the so-called unchallengeable founts of Australian history. So much still remains unknown to most Australians, and the term hunter-gatherer is stamped into the forehead of the Aboriginal, tattooed with unworthiness. Charles Sturt had his life saved in Central Australia when he came upon people who were harvesting a river valley and supplied him with water, roast duck and cake. Both Mitchell and Sturt described the cake as the lightest and sweetest they had ever tasted. How many historians have read those comments, and yet not one has considered that it would be in the nation's commercial and culinary interests to find the grass that made the flour that made the cake. Oh, we love to talk about bush tomato, lemon myrtle and wattle seed, because they fit our venal belief in the hunting and gathering Aborigine. But when asked to consider the virtues of agricultural products grown on fields so wide the explorers could see neither their beginning nor the end, we become flummoxed, querulous. These crops are perennial, and they were staples of Aboriginal diet and economy. The word staple suggests permanence and utility, and the absence of those words in our understanding of pre-colonial history form the sole basis for the application of Terra Nullius. Australia is a drying continent. World and national inaction on the human contribution to climate change is leading to a situation where we will soon struggle to irrigate crops. Aboriginal domesticates do not require any more moisture than the Australian climate provides, no more fertiliser than our soils already contain, and as they are adapted to Australian pests, they need no pesticide. My family and I have been growing these foods for 6 years on the south coast of New South Wales, and will conduct our first commercial harvests of yam and grain in February 2019. These plants are an environmental boon to the nation, apart from the fact that, as they're all perennial, with large root masses of the plants adapted to dry conditions, they sequester carbon. If we only dedicated 5% of our current agricultural lands to these plants, we would go a long way to meeting our carbon emission reduction targets. These foods are not only good for the environment and our health, they also teach us a truer history and can bring all Australians together around the kitchen table. But apart from that, recent archaeology has discovered an 80,000-year-old midden at Warrnambool, a 65,000-year-old grinding stone in Arnhem Land, and the remains of the oldest village on earth in Western New South Wales. So, Aboriginal Australians not only invented bread, they also invented society. Here's our chance to celebrate the real history of the country and to begin growing the foods adapted to our climate and domesticated by Aborigines. Let's get rid of the idea of the hapless hunter-gatherer and recognise the ingenuity of the first Australians.